Northern Chile stretches into a landscape shaped by absence. Rain rarely reaches the Atacama Desert, and when it does, it is brief and easily forgotten. The ground is pale and dry, broken by rock and mineral seams exposed by time. Vegetation is sparse. Settlements are scattered and often temporary, existing only where work requires them to exist. Near the city of Copiapó, the land rises into low, uneven hills. Roads narrow as they move away from the coast, passing abandoned shafts and processing plants that mark earlier periods of extraction. Mining has long been part of this region's economy, and the terrain carries the signs of it: tailings, access tunnels, and reinforced openings cut directly into stone. The San Jose mine sat within this environment. It was neither the largest nor the deepest mine in the region. It operated quietly, producing copper and gold from beneath the desert floor. From the surface, the mine appeared unremarkable, an industrial site bordered by earth and sky, with little to distinguish one workday from another. Below ground, the temperature increased steadily. The air became heavier as distance from the surface grew. Light narrowed to artificial sources, fixed to helmets and tunnel walls. The soundscape was consistent: machinery, ventilation, movement against rock. On the morning of August 5, 2010, conditions at the surface offered no indication of change. There was no storm. No seismic warning that registered above ground. The desert remained still as it had for centuries. Work continued as planned. Men entered the mine and descended along familiar routes, moving deeper into a space that had become routine through repetition. At that moment, the environment held no visible threat. The mine functioned as it had the day before. Nothing yet suggested that the separation between surface and underground would soon become absolute. The San Jose mine had been in operation for decades, changing ownership and management several times. By 2010, it was operated by the San Esteban Primera Mining Company, a privately owned firm based in Chile. The mine extracted copper and small amounts of gold from veins that ran deep beneath the Atacama Desert. Production levels were modest compared to larger industrial operations in the region, but steady enough to justify continued work. The mine's layout extended more than 700 meters below the surface, accessed through a spiraling ramp rather than a vertical shaft. This design allowed vehicles and heavy equipment to move underground but also increased the length of the route between the surface and the deepest working areas. Over time, sections of the mine had been reinforced, repaired, or abandoned as rock conditions changed. Safety concerns were not new. Chilean regulators had cited the San Jose mine multiple times in the years before 2010 for structural instability and inadequate safety measures. Temporary closures had occurred, followed by reopenings after limited improvements. Despite these warnings, the mine remained active. For many workers in the region, employment options were limited, and mining provided consistent income in an otherwise unforgiving environment. The men who worked there represented a wide cross-section of Chilean society. Some were experienced miners with decades underground. Others were younger, having entered the profession out of economic necessity rather than tradition. Many lived in nearby towns, commuting daily. A few traveled from farther away, staying in temporary housing near the site during work rotations. Their skills varied. Electricians, drill operators, mechanics, and general laborers all worked together within the same confined spaces. Most had been trained informally, learning procedures through observation and repetition rather than formal instruction. The work required coordination, patience, and acceptance of risk as a routine condition. August 5th began as a normal shift. Equipment was checked. Assignments were distributed. The miners descended gradually, following the curved ramp downward. For many, the environment below ground was familiar enough to feel controlled. Rock walls and tunnels were known landmarks rather than unknown hazards. No emergency had been declared. No evacuation order had been issued. The mine was operating within its usual parameters, and the men below had no reason to expect that this descent would be different from those that had come before. The separation between surface and underground remained procedural, not final. That distinction would change without warning. The 33 men underground that day ranged in age from their early 20s to their early 60s. Some had worked at the San Jose mine for years. Others were newer, having joined as contracts opened or as older workers moved on. Together, they formed a temporary workforce bound less by shared background than by shared routine. Many came from mining families, raised in towns where extraction shaped daily life. Others had entered mining later, after work in construction, agriculture, or transportation proved unreliable. Formal education levels varied. Practical knowledge, however, was valued more than credentials. Experience with equipment, awareness of tunnel conditions, and familiarity with the rhythms of underground labor mattered most. Their reasons for being there were not unusual. Mining wages were higher than those offered by many other jobs in the region. The work was difficult and hazardous, but it provided stability. For some, it supported extended families. For others, it was a temporary means toward long-term plans elsewhere. On August 5th, assignments placed the men at different points within the mine. Some operated drilling equipment. Others transported or maintained machinery. Communication occurred through radios and direct contact in the tunnels. The system relied on predictable movement and timing. Underground, distinctions between day and night did not exist. Shifts were defined by clocks rather than light. The men adapted their bodies to this schedule, eating and resting according to work demands. Heat was constant, often exceeding temperatures at the surface. Ventilation systems pushed air downward, but humidity remained high. The mine's refuge chamber, designed for emergency use, was known to the workers but rarely discussed. It was located near the deepest operational areas and stocked with limited supplies intended to last for a short period. It was not a place meant for prolonged occupancy. As the shift progressed, there was no shared sense of concern. Machinery functioned normally. Rock conditions appeared stable by routine standards. Any minor falls or vibrations were treated as part of the environment rather than warning signs. The men continued their tasks with the expectation that the shift would end as it always did. Vehicles would climb the ramp back to the surface. Light would widen again. The desert air would replace the heat below. What followed occurred without ceremony and without advance notice. The moment that transformed routine into isolation arrived suddenly and without negotiation. At approximately 2 p.m. local time on August 5, 2010, a massive rockfall occurred within the San Jose mine. The collapse took place near the main access ramp, roughly 700 meters below the surface. An estimated 700,000 metric tons of rock broke loose, blocking the primary route that connected the working levels to the surface. The failure was sudden. There was no extended warning period and no opportunity for evacuation. The rockfall destroyed ladders, crushed vehicles, and filled the access tunnel with debris. Dust spread rapidly through the lower levels, reducing visibility and forcing the men to retreat from the affected area. Initial attempts to assess the damage confirmed the scale of the obstruction. The ramp, which served as the mine's central artery, was no longer passable. Secondary escape routes existed on paper, but many had been compromised or were inaccessible due to the collapse's reach. Communication with the surface was lost almost immediately. The miners regrouped and moved toward the designated emergency shelter, known as the refuge chamber. It was located deeper within the mine, away from the main ramp. Reaching it required navigating through tunnels that remained intact, guided by helmet lamps and memory. Once inside the chamber, the men accounted for one another. All 33 were present. No fatalities had occurred during the initial collapse, though some sustained minor injuries. The chamber was designed to support a limited number of people for a short duration, intended as a temporary holding area until rescue or evacuation. From above ground, the collapse registered as a serious but uncertain event. The mine's entrance was damaged and access points were blocked. Rescue teams could not immediately determine whether anyone had survived. Initial assumptions were cautious. Past collapses in the mine had resulted in fatalities. Below ground, the miners faced a different reality. The tunnel that connected them to the surface no longer existed in any usable form. The depth and scale of the obstruction made self-rescue impossible. Their situation was now defined by enclosure and time. The distinction between underground work and isolation disappeared. The men were no longer on a shift. They were sealed beneath the desert, with no direct contact and no clear indication of when or if help would arrive. The survival phase began without ceremony. The refuge chamber lay deeper than the collapsed ramp, positioned as a final measure rather than a place meant for extended habitation. It consisted of a reinforced space carved into rock, sealed by heavy doors. Its purpose was functional: to provide air, limited supplies, and protection until rescue teams could reach those trapped. Inside, the temperature was high. Heat accumulated quickly, produced by the surrounding rock and the bodies within the confined space. Humidity rose as well, clinging to skin and clothing. Ventilation was minimal, relying on systems that were not designed for prolonged use by dozens of people. The supplies inside the chamber reflected its intended role. There were emergency rations meant to last a short time: canned food, crackers, powdered milk, and limited water. Medical equipment was basic. There was no natural light. Illumination came entirely from electric lamps and headlamps, which had to be conserved. Space was restricted. The men sat or lay close together, organizing themselves to allow movement where possible. Personal belongings were minimal, carried only what could be kept on a person during a work shift. There was no privacy. The environment allowed for no separation between individual experience and group existence. The first hours were spent assessing what remained intact. Inventory was taken carefully. Food quantities were counted. Water reserves were measured. Batteries were checked. These actions were deliberate, slow, and practical. There was no outward panic, but there was a clear understanding that the chamber was not built for 70 days. The air itself became a concern. Carbon dioxide levels rose as oxygen was consumed. Ventilation systems were adjusted manually where possible. The men limited unnecessary movement to reduce exertion and heat generation. Time lost its familiar structure almost immediately. Without sunlight, without clocks synchronized to the surface, the day became an estimate rather than a measurement. Sleep occurred when exhaustion demanded it. Wakefulness followed without reference to morning or night. Above them, the desert remained unchanged. Below, the refuge chamber became the entire known world. This was the space in which survival would have to be managed, not improvised. Every decision now carried weight, measured against uncertainty and the absence of information. Within the first day, it became clear that the supplies in the refuge chamber could not sustain 33 men for more than a brief period if consumed normally. The food stored there had been calculated for a much smaller group and for a limited number of hours. Water, in particular, was scarce. Leadership emerged through practicality rather than authority. Decisions were made collectively but enforced consistently. Food was divided into precise portions. Each man received a small amount at regular intervals, often no more than a few spoonfuls of tuna or a biscuit shared among several people. Milk was diluted. Water was measured by the capful. The rationing plan was designed not around comfort but around extension. The goal was to slow consumption enough to allow time for rescue efforts, if any were underway. There was no information from the surface. The men did not know whether the collapse had been detected, or whether anyone knew they were alive. Physical hunger became constant. It did not escalate sharply but settled into a persistent presence. Thirst followed the same pattern. Energy levels dropped and movement slowed. Tasks were performed deliberately with minimal waste of effort. Discipline was essential. No one was allowed to eat outside the agreed schedule. Supplies were stored centrally and monitored. This structure reduced conflict and prevented individual decisions from affecting the group's survival. The men understood that adherence was not optional. Water conservation extended beyond drinking. Washing was limited or stopped entirely. Sweat accumulated. Skin conditions developed. The heat made these restrictions difficult to tolerate, but there was no alternative. As days passed, the body adjusted in limited ways. Metabolism slowed. Weight loss became noticeable. Fatigue increased, but so did efficiency in conserving energy. The men spent long periods seated or lying still, speaking only when necessary. The absence of external markers made time abstract. Rations became the primary method of measuring days. Each distribution marked another interval survived. Each delay in rescue increased the importance of restraint. Rationing was not simply about food and water. It was about controlling behavior under conditions where resources and information were both limited. The system held not because it was comfortable but because it was consistent. Survival depended on patience as much as endurance. As the days extended beyond initial expectations, the absence of natural light began to affect perception and routine. Without sunrise or sunset, the distinction between day and night dissolved. The men relied on agreed schedules rather than physical cues, marking time through meals, brief rest periods, and assigned tasks. Sleep became irregular. Some men rested for short intervals, waking frequently due to heat or discomfort. Others remained awake for extended periods before exhaustion forced rest. Headaches became common. Concentration required effort. The artificial lighting was kept low to conserve power, leaving much of the chamber in shadow. The physical environment imposed constant strain. Temperatures inside the refuge chamber often exceeded 30 degrees Celsius. Humidity remained high. Sweat did not evaporate easily and clothing stayed damp. Skin infections and rashes developed. Minor wounds healed slowly. Hygiene was limited to necessity. With water restricted, washing was reduced to minimal cleaning of hands and faces. Makeshift latrines were established in designated areas, separated as much as possible from living space. Odors accumulated. There was no way to fully control them. Food intake continued at minimal levels. Weight loss accelerated. Muscle mass decreased. Movement became slower and more deliberate. Some men experienced dizziness when standing. These effects were monitored informally, observed rather than recorded. Despite these conditions, routine was maintained. Tasks were rotated to avoid exhaustion. Equipment was checked daily. Ventilation adjustments were made by hand. Small maintenance actions gave structure to time and reinforced a sense of purpose. Psychological pressure increased gradually. The absence of external information created uncertainty that could not be resolved internally. To counter this, conversation was kept practical. Stories from the past were shared sparingly. Silence was common and accepted. Faith practices emerged for some, conducted quietly and without obligation. Others focused on calculation, estimating days, supplies, or rescue timelines based on limited knowledge. No single strategy dominated. Adaptation varied by individual. Life in the chamber narrowed to immediate concerns: air, water, food, rest. The world above ground existed only in memory and assumption. Survival became repetitive, defined by maintenance rather than progress. Time did not pass quickly or slowly. It passed without reference. As confinement continued, structure became the primary defense against decline. The men formalized routines that had begun informally. Responsibilities were assigned and rotated. Some monitored ventilation and temperature. Others oversaw food distribution or waste management. These roles were practical, but they also reinforced a sense of order. Leadership remained functional. Decisions were made through discussion, often led by those with more experience underground. Authority was not absolute, but it was respected because it was consistent. Disagreements occurred, but they were contained. There was little room for prolonged conflict. Communication efforts were sustained despite limited tools. Radios were checked repeatedly, though no signal reached the surface. Tapping on pipes and rock was attempted at intervals, following known mining practices for signaling distress. These efforts were methodical rather than hopeful, repeated because they were possible. Mental endurance varied. Some men withdrew, conserving energy by limiting interaction. Others remained more engaged, helping to maintain morale through conversation or shared tasks. Humor appeared occasionally, brief and restrained. It was not used to distract from reality but to acknowledge it. Religious observance continued for those who practiced it, usually in quiet moments. Group prayer occurred at times, but participation was voluntary. These practices did not change conditions, but they provided continuity with life above ground. Medical issues required attention. One miner with diabetes was monitored closely. Others suffered from infections or injuries that would normally require external treatment. Care was improvised using the limited medical supplies available. Decisions were cautious, focused on preventing deterioration rather than achieving recovery. The lack of news from the surface weighed on everyone. Calculations were made repeatedly: how long supplies might last, how long drilling might take if rescue had begun. Without confirmation, these calculations remained theoretical. Despite uncertainty, discipline held. The routines were followed. The rules were respected. Survival was approached as a collective responsibility, not an individual effort. By maintaining order in an environment designed for none, the men preserved more than resources. They preserved function. By the third and fourth weeks underground, the physical effects of confinement became more pronounced. Weight loss was visible across the group. Clothing hung loosely. Faces appeared thinner. Energy levels declined further, and tasks that once required little effort now demanded planning and rest. Medical conditions that had been manageable above ground became risks. One miner with diabetes required careful monitoring despite the absence of proper medication and regular meals. Blood sugar levels could not be measured accurately, so symptoms were observed instead. Others developed infections in the skin and gums, aggravated by humidity, poor nutrition, and limited hygiene. Muscle weakness increased. Prolonged sitting and reduced movement led to stiffness and pain. Standing too quickly caused dizziness for several men. To reduce strain, tasks were shortened and shared. Physical exertion was minimized whenever possible. Psychological pressure intensified alongside physical decline. The lack of external contact extended uncertainty beyond endurance. Days blended together. Some men experienced difficulty tracking how long they had been underground. Memory of the surface became less immediate, replaced by the routines of the chamber. Moments of tension occurred, usually tied to fatigue or discomfort rather than conflict. Irritability rose, then receded. The group addressed these moments quietly, adjusting schedules or redistributing tasks to reduce friction. No serious breakdowns occurred, but the margin for error narrowed. Sleep deprivation compounded other stresses. Heat and humidity disrupted rest. Without a natural circadian rhythm, some men slept in short cycles, others in longer but irregular periods. Dreams became vivid for some, indistinct for others. Waking brought no clear sense of time passed. Despite decline, critical functions were preserved. Ventilation remained operational. Rations continued without interruption. Medical issues were contained, though not resolved. The system held, but it required constant attention. Above ground, drilling efforts continued, though the men below had no confirmation of progress. Each day without contact increased the possibility that survival would end quietly, unnoticed. The body adapts within limits. Underground, those limits approached steadily, measured not by panic but by attrition. On August 22, 17 days after the collapse, the first signs of progress from the surface reached the miners. A small borehole, drilled through the rock above the refuge chamber, finally connected the men to the outside world. Through this narrow channel, messages could be passed, initially in the form of notes attached to small objects. The miners responded immediately, providing their names, the number of survivors, and their condition. 33 men remained alive. The transmission confirmed that the collapse had been detected and that efforts to reach them were underway. While the information did not alter the physical challenges of their environment, it offered practical guidance and the first evidence that rescue was feasible. Supplies followed shortly. Food and water were lowered through the borehole. Packages contained high-calorie items, liquids, and basic medical provisions. The miners rationed these new deliveries carefully, integrating them into the existing plan rather than consuming them immediately. Each distribution reinforced the structure that had sustained them from the beginning. Communication also allowed them to provide updates on medical needs. Minor injuries and pre-existing conditions were described so that surface teams could prioritize appropriate care and supplies. The miners' descriptions were precise and factual, avoiding exaggeration or assumption about timelines. Air quality and temperature remained concerns. Engineers adjusted ventilation and considered methods for stabilizing the chamber further. Small instruments and tools were delivered to monitor conditions more accurately, although the miners continued to rely primarily on observation. Psychological relief was measured. There was acknowledgement that help was coming, but the situation remained serious. Time underground continued and risks were unchanged. Each man understood that rescue required patience and that maintaining discipline and routines remained essential. The borehole also served as a lifeline for calculation. Men could estimate drilling progress and anticipate stages of extraction, though uncertainty persisted. They marked days, rationed carefully, and continued schedules for sleep, work, and observation. In the refuge chamber, life remained contained. Progress was visible but incremental. The contact did not change the environment. It provided only verification and small, controlled assistance. The men continued to endure the same heat, humidity, and restricted space that had defined the past 2 weeks. Survival was no longer entirely speculative. Confirmation from above established the reality of rescue, yet it remained a distant objective, dependent on engineering, persistence, and careful planning. On October 13, 2010, after 69 days underground, the final phase of the San Jose mine rescue commenced. A specially constructed capsule, lowered through a borehole drilled over several weeks, allowed each man to be extracted individually. The operation was precise, methodical, and controlled. There was no rush beyond logistical coordination, only careful execution to ensure the safety of those inside the narrow shaft. The first miners emerged to the surface without spectacle. Emergency personnel checked vital signs, assisted with the transition from confined space to open air, and transported them to medical facilities. There was no celebration beyond acknowledgement of survival and the relief of functional closure. Each man was quiet, measured, and fatigued. The desert around them remained still, unchanged from the day the collapse occurred. Extraction continued steadily, miner by miner, until all 33 had been brought to the surface. Weight loss, exhaustion, and minor medical conditions were immediately addressed, but there were no dramatic rescues or public displays of emotion at the moment of emergence. The miners were physically alive, psychologically disciplined, and structurally intact after an ordeal defined by patience and routine. The event entered historical record not because of heroism or spectacle, but because it demonstrated endurance under extreme, prolonged isolation. The miners had survived an environment that stripped away the normal markers of time, comfort, and connection. Their survival was measured in precise rationing, functional discipline, and the application of practical knowledge rather than chance or luck. In the days that followed, their recovery was monitored quietly. Rehabilitation included medical treatment, nutritional support, and psychological counseling to adjust to sunlight and open space. The men returned to their communities not as triumphant figures, but as individuals who had endured a constrained environment through methodical survival. The incident underscored human resilience when structure and routine are maintained under conditions of extreme deprivation. It also highlighted the consequences of environmental hazards, industrial oversight, and the reliance on collective discipline for prolonged endurance. The San Jose mine continues to exist in memory and record, not as a spectacle of rescue, but as a case study in survival under severe confinement. The miners' 70 days underground became a historical testament to endurance, patience, and the quiet application of knowledge in the absence of control.